With you all this chilly evening. And frankly, it's also sort of a delight to be out and about when you spend much of your life researching and thinking about and writing about people who are long gone. It's great to come out and to be with people on the same side of the grass. And, and also you learn a lot when you do so, both meeting potential readers, current readers, but you also learn a lot about yourself as well, too. So a number of years ago, maybe 8 or 9 years ago, I was the last minute fill-in speaker for a philanthropic organization in Ann Arbor. And even though this was sort of an 11th hour thing, it was done very well. They had a luncheon, white tablecloths, all of this. I gave my talk that went over well, and they had arranged with a local Ann Arbor bookstore to sell my then current book. And so after the talk, I'm there, and there's a line of people, and there's a woman at the end. And she comes up, she's got her book ready for me to sign, and she says, "Well, I see you're talking at First Presbyterian on Tuesday." And I said, "Oh, yes, 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 that's my church and how much I loved it. And but I was going to be talking about a different, topic than the one I just spoke about and stuff like that." And I'm just yammering on, and she's patiently waiting for me to shut up so she can buy the book. And so finally I signed the book and I hand it to her and I say, "Well, I'll see you on Tuesday." And she sort of squints and tilts her head and says, "Well, I'm not going to see you on Tuesday. I've already heard you speak once. Surely you don't expect me to have to listen to you again." So the good news for you all is after tonight, you get a you get out of jail free card. The other thing I want to point out is I was not in a knife fight, but since I can see that many of you all are of my generation, I had a squamous cell carcinoma removed a week ago. I had my stitches out today, and I've got a pretty gnarly scar. And rather than you all have to look at it, we thought we would cover it up. All right. So what I want to talk about is sort of put the book into context a little bit, talk a little bit about it, and then we can open things up. So I think first of all, it's important to remember, and there are many things that some of you all already know, so I apologize for that. But it's important to remember that the Civil War remains to this day the central event in the history of the United States. And even more so than the American Revolution, this was a moment where what it is, who we were as a people, what we believed in, and also who is going to be allowed to participate in this, the world's greatest experiment in democracy. These questions were at absolutely front and center and of immense importance. It's also important to remember that the Civil War, of course, was the bloodiest war in our history. Now, I can tell by looking at some of you that, like me, I was raised by the World War II generation. My dad was in the Army Air Corps. My mom worked for the Army. I had an aunt who was a wave. I had multiple uncles who were all fighting in the Pacific. But beyond that, all of our neighbors, you knew, oh, well, he was a bombardier in a B-17. He was on an aircraft carrier in the Pacific. Boy Scout leaders, Little League coaches, teachers. So the war was very much a presence in my life growing up. And it's important to remember that during World War II, one out of every 350 Americans died during the war, in the war. The number for the Vietnam War, which was going on while I was growing up, was one out of every 300, or rather, one out of every 3,500 Americans. The same number for the Gulf Wars, the Iraq War, the Afghan War, something like one out of every 55,000 Americans died. Well, the number for the Civil War was one out of every 50. There was not a family in this country that was not affected and affected deeply by the war itself. There's another statistic as well, too, equally important, was that during the course of the Civil War, one out of every seven Americans went from being enslaved to being free. So this is a titanic event in our history, reshaping our economy, reshaping our politics. It was also the first truly modern war in human history. It didn't start out that way. Bull Run looks very much like a Napoleonic battle, but 4.5 years later, in the mud and the trenches of Petersburg, the war very much starts to look like World War I. It was also the first modern war where entire societies were mobilized for the battle on both sides. Women are very important to the war effort on both sides. African Americans are key to the war effort as well. Now, one thing about the war that happens, and this happens in a lot of historical events, is this notion that the outcome of the war was foreseen early on. At an early book talk I gave this summer, the husband of one of my wife's friends was a good Washington and Lee graduate. He got up and said, "Well, that just wasn't the case at all." The first week of class, the professor showed us a map that showed all of the railroads in the northern states and how few there were in the southern states, talked about the industrial capacity of the North, all of that, and said, well, there was no question the North was going to win. I don't mean that. There was never a question that the Confederate flag was going to fly over Boston Common or Central Park. That wasn't going to happen. But the question was the Confederacy going to survive as an independent country or not? Or alternatively, were the seceded states going to be allowed to rejoin the Union and have slavery survive? That's the question. And that was not preordained. It wasn't preordained in 1861 or 1862 or 1863. But ironically, when my book opens during the spring of 1864, there was a tidal wave of hope and optimism that this was going to be the year. This was the year that the North was going to win, the Confederacy was going to be defeated, and come the fall, by the time the leaves fall, Richmond would have been captured, Lee would have been defeated, and the war would have been over. And there were good reasons for people to believe that. The first was that the largest army ever assembled in the Western Hemisphere had been positioned between Washington, D.C., and the Rapidan River in Northern Virginia, the Union Army, of course. And this was not the Union Army of the early years of the war that was consistently outfought and outmaneuvered. You now have tens and tens and tens of thousands of battle-hardened Union soldiers. They know how to fight, and they are equally the match of the Confederate soldiers as well, too. But there was a brand new commander of that army. Now, that commander was not somebody that people would mistake for a modern day George Washington, a handsome, eloquent 6-footer on a horse, who spoke beautifully and all this stuff. Instead, he was this short, scruffy guy who wore dentures. He often had a soiled uniform that he wore. He was a bomb at small talk. He hated formality. He had indeed graduated from West Point, but he had spent his spare hours at the academy reading Jane Austen and romantic novels. He had fought without distinction in the Mexican War. Then he was billeted out to Vancouver Barracks in Washington Territory, where he promptly lost all of his savings in the gambling dens across the Columbia River in Portland, Oregon. He then resigns from the Army, and when the war breaks out, his career path has led him to be an assistant clerk in a leather goods store in the metropolis of Galena, Illinois. But the Union needed officers, and when the war broke out, Ulysses S. Grant was recommissioned into the Union Army, and he had early victories out west. And that eventually caught the eye of Lincoln, and particularly after Grant had solved the great riddle of Vicksburg, the Confederate citadel on the Mississippi River, and by capturing Vicksburg, which led to the final control of the Mississippi by the Union, the Confederacy was split into two. So now you have this incredible new commander, you have this gigantic army, and it's time to move. And when Grant took the army across the Rapidan, the press of the North, the newspapers of the North, absolutely went nuts over this. That there's no question we're going to end the war now. We've got the men, we've got the right man at the head of it. The New York Herald, in fact, at great expense on their front page, they printed a three-quarter page map of everything from Washington, D.C. down to Richmond, so the readers could follow along day by day as the Union Army on its victorious march down south. All right. And there was this great euphoria and joy in a sense, we're going to finally end this awful bloody thing. Instead, as many as you know, Grant ran into a buzzsaw. First at the Wilderness, this gloomy area in Virginia, where the shrubbery and the trees were so thick, there hardly anyone lived there. There were hardly any roads. Soldiers could not see farther than 10 paces in front of them. There were parts of the Wilderness where sunlight never hit the forest floor. And of course, as he moves in, Lee is waiting for them, ambushes the Union Army, terrific fighting for days. When regular tactics are not going to work, standard charges, cavalry is not happening, artillery is not particularly helpful. And by the end of it, Grant has lost more than 17,000 soldiers killed, captured, or missing. And at the end of the battle, the underbrush catches fire in the Wilderness, and so many of the wounded on both sides were incinerated. So 1 week later at Spotsylvania Courthouse, Grant Lee is waiting for Grant once again. He's got good ground. He's built battlements and fortifications. Grant launches what is going to be the largest infantry charge in the history of the Western Hemisphere. Once again, larger than Pickett's charge, 20,000 Union troops from 10 different states. They're carrying 120 different battle flags. They go off at the Confederate position there at the Bloody Angle. And instead, what happens is too many soldiers all get jammed together in this confined area. The command structure breaks down. And instead, what happens is you have 22 hours of fighting that has been described as the most desperate fighting in the entire Civil War. During the course of this battle, by the afternoon, it starts to rain. The gunpowder is not going to work on arms. And so what happens is Union and Confederate soldiers fight like soldiers did during the Trojan War, choking each other to death, clubbing each other, stabbing each other with swords. It goes on and on. A North Carolina survivor of it later wrote, they said, when I die, I'm not worried about going to hell because I've already been to a worse place. By the end of Spotsylvania, Grant has now had an additional 18,000 Union casualties. So within the matter of less than 2 weeks, he's lost nearly a third of his army. And 2 weeks after that, his army calls to a halt and begins the siege of Petersburg. So the word now is that the war is not going to be over by the time the leaves fall. The war is not going to be over anytime soon. Instead, we've had an absolutely horrific, bloody spring. And this is a terrific gut punch to the morale of loyal citizens in the North. Instead of victory, they have column after column of the names of dead Union soldiers and officers that appear in newspapers in Hartford and Philadelphia and Boston and New York and on and on and on. And there's more bad news that happens that summer when a Confederate army under General Jubal Early manages to slip away out of Union sight. It marches down, which means north, down the Shenandoah Valley in record time, crosses the Potomac River at Shepherdstown, Virginia, West Virginia, and then makes a hard right turn and makes a beeline for Washington, D.C. They get slowed up temporarily at the Battle of Monocacy, but they go on, and in fact, Confederate soldiers invade the northern part of the District of Columbia. And then there's a great riddle that happens because Erble's troops were within hours of capturing and burning the Capitol, the White House, maybe capturing congressmen, the Supreme Court. Lincoln would have likely gotten away. And for reasons we don't quite understand, he hesitates at the last moment. Some of his subordinate commanders later wrote, why the hell did we do that? I could have taken everything in front of me, but they stopped. There was some skirmishing the next day, but he had waited too long. Reinforcements started to come up. And in fact, Lincoln was almost killed at Fort Stevens there near the end of that engagement. He went out to one of the ring of forts around the district, and rather than get behind a wall or anything, he stood up, on a parapet and is looking out. And 200 yards away, there are Confederate sharpshooters. Well, guess who they're shooting at? This tall guy with a really tall hat. And bullets are whizzing by. Officers are at, Mr. President, please get down. He ignores them all until an assistant Union surgeon standing 3 feet from him catches a round in the leg, and finally Lincoln comes down. But, again, the cumulative impact of all this news is just devastating. The Confederacy isn't on its last legs. They almost captured Washington, D.C. And what happens is that a nascent peace movement in the North starts to gain ground. And the notion is we've lost too many of our husbands, our sons, our fathers, our lovers. It's time just to let the South go. Let's be done with this and let's just get out of here. And in fact, for Lincoln, this is the great political crisis of his life. The kingmaker of the Republican Party in those days was a gentleman, a New Yorker by the name of Thurlow Weed. And Weed was interesting because when Lincoln originally had won the Republican nomination in 1860 to be the Republican candidate for president, that most of the newspapers in the East said, this hayseed hick from the prairies can't string two sentences together. There's no way anything's going to happen with him. He's a redneck nobody. But what Thurlow Weed did is he took a 2-day train ride from New York to Springfield to meet Lincoln in person, spent a couple days with him, and concluded at the end of that visit that Lincoln was a political genius. He wasn't a hayseed at all, and he became one of Lincoln's great advisors. Well, in August of 1864, he came to the White House and met with Lincoln and delivered the news that there's no way in hell that you're going to get reelected in November. It's over. You need to pull out of the race. There are already other candidates who are lining up to be the Republican candidate for presidency. And Lincoln got this news from his other close friends and advisors as well, too, that his candidacy was over. In fact, by early that fall, there was something called a famous blind memoranda, where he calls his cabinet members together, writes out something on a piece of paper, folds it over so they can't see what they're signing, has each of them sign their names to this. And it was a document that said that it's clear that this administration is not going to get reelected, but between the time of the election and when the new president is inaugurated, that they would all swear to try to hold the country together during that period. Okay. So this is by the end of the summer of 1864, this is a very dark period, for Union war efforts, for the sense that we are going to be able to preserve the country. So meanwhile, what are the Confederates doing? Well, the Confederates have had a deep, understanding and realization, through what happened, even though the Union lost more casualties at Wilderness and Spotsylvania, there were significant Confederate casualties as well. But the problem is that due to differences in the population, the Confederates could not replace their losses. The Union could, because it was more populous. And what the Confederate High Command and Jefferson Davis now know is there's no way in the world they're going to be able to defeat the Union on the battlefield. And especially so now that you have this siege situation when you have static battle lines along the Richmond-Petersburg front, because early on, one of the great tools the Confederacy had, certainly by Jackson and Lee, is their mobility. And now they're stuck, and if we just play this out, we're going to lose. Well, the reality is there is no lack of determination amongst the supporters of the Confederacy. They are determined that their country shall be free. They are determined that their way of life, which they think is the real American way of life, with slavery being a central feature of it, they're trying to figure out a way to keep going. And what they realize is we have to figure out a new way to fight. We can't just fight on the battlefield. And the new way that they determine how to fight is they're going to launch a terror campaign against the civilian population of the North in an effort to move the needle of public opinion towards the folks that want to have a negotiated end to the war. Let's end the fighting. Let's end the war with the hope that the Confederacy will be able to come out of this in one piece. Now, this is a very much a well-funded effort that's largely undertaken by the Confederate Secret Service. The head of the Confederate Secret Service moved to Canada, is operating out of Montreal and Toronto. He's got $500,000 in 1864 dollars. That's a lot of money. And they're funding different efforts, and there are a wide variety of them, quite creative. There's a raid that's taken part by a group of Confederate Secret Service agents and escaped Confederate POWs who've made it to Canada. They posing as hunters. They go from Quebec. They raid the border town of St. Albans, Vermont. They rob the banks. They shoot up the town. They kill people. It's not a lot of damage, but it creates a sensation in New England. There's a long border with Canada. When are they going to strike next? There's an attempt to capture steamships on Lake Erie and use those, convert them into battleships of a form to attack the shipping in the Great Lakes. There are a number of plans to either to murder or kidnap President Lincoln, a Confederate agent by the name of Thomas Conrad Nelson, who had been a high school teacher in Georgetown, becomes a Confederate agent. He spends his days at Lafayette Square, right across from the White House, making note of when Lincoln leaves the White House, what time, what route does he go, particularly as Lincoln goes from the White House to the soldiers' home in the northern part of the district where he's going to spend the evening during the summer months. There's a pro-Confederate doctor who goes to Bermuda and there had been a smallpox epidemic there. He purchased the clothes of smallpox victims with the idea of bringing them to the U.S., reselling them at public markets, New York, Boston, and Philadelphia, in an effort that wouldn't have worked, but an effort to see if he could create a smallpox epidemic in the North. There are plans to blow up the White House. And the most spectacular event is when 8 Confederate Secret Service agents leave Montreal by train, go to New York City under aliases, check into 18 different hotels. And before they do that, they send a member of their group to a pro-Confederate chemist who lives 1 block from Washington Square, where he purchases a heavy valise that has 18 vials of something called Greek fire, which is essentially the metal sodium suspended in a liquid solution. When the sodium is exposed to the air, it bursts into flame. And their plan is to burn down Manhattan by setting off these fires at the same time in hotels. And they come quite close to doing that. And, and the Confederates are looking a lot of other ways. Despite the fact that there's not as much industry in the South, the Confederates were ahead of time in different armaments and things like that. They're the ones who really advance landmines known as torpedoes. But by the end of the war, by that summer, a Maryland-born former Columbia and Princeton chemistry professor who defected to the South is busily trying to invent poison gas to use in St. Petersburg. So as it turns out, though, the Confederacy had one more weapon, and that weapon was John Wilkes Booth. All right. And this, to me, was the greatest surprise of doing this book. Now, the version of John Wilkes Booth that I was taught, incidentally, at Robert E. Lee Elementary School in Tulsa, Oklahoma, was actually the version that you were taught too, which was that Booth was a second-rate, second-class actor who lived in the shadow of his far more famous father and brother actors, that he really didn't get much attention, that he was a rational, emotional, sort of an archetype of a John Hinckley or Lee Harvey Oswald. And he was nothing like that at all. And the reason we know that is because of the wonderful fact that, thank God, that the history of the Civil War has never been the sole property of college professors. And instead, there have always been dedicated amateurs, much like many of you, who are interested in a certain part of the history of the Civil War and over the years become experts in them. There was a gentleman by the name of Arthur F. Louvre, now deceased, He was the father of daughters, a husband. He spent his career working in the insurance industry in Pennsylvania. But on weekends and on evenings, on family vacations, he decided he was going to locate every single mention of John Wilkes Booth on paper and newspapers, in documents. And he began this incidentally, well before the ancestry.com and newspapers.com era. He must have spent years at the National Archives and Library of Congress, but he ended up creating a chronology of Booth's life. And he self-published posthumously as a book called John Wilkes Booth Day by Day. It's about 300 pages long. It has fully documented. I was able to get a copy, and it's a remarkable book. You can turn to June 5th, 1863, a Tuesday. Booth played Hamlet at the Cuyahoga Theater in Cleveland. June 6th, Wednesday, Booth took a train from Cleveland to Chicago. June 7th, he appeared at the Michigan Theater as Othello. On and on and on and on. And as I got this and started reading this, but then looked up the sources, I realized Booth wasn't a second-rate actor. He was an absolute superstar of the American stage. He sells out theaters from Portland, Maine to Chicago, from Indianapolis to Nashville, Washington, D.C., Boston, you name it. Hundreds are turned away from his performances. Dozens of women hang out outside of his dressing rooms trying to catch a glimpse of him. There was a wonderful actress by the name of, oh God, her name, Clark, uh, anyway, who talked about how when after the next morning after a show they would go in to get breakfast somewhere. She said all of the waitresses would suddenly ignore everyone else and just hover around this Brad Pitt like George Clooney figure. Do you want some more pancakes? Would you like some bacon? Would you like coffee? There's recordings of chambermaids in hotels who would sneak back in to make sure his pillows were just aligned perfectly. But what's remarkable is that the theater critics of the country loved him as well. You look at these papers, genius, 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 New York Times. It seems as if these words Shakespeare wrote were written for him. We've never heard a better Richard on either side of the Atlantic Ocean. It just goes on and on and on. And so once and he also, Booth brings a physicality to the American stage that had never existed before. Booth was very athletic. In fact, John Ford of Ford's Theater, when Booth was playing Macbeth there, he had John Ford build a 12-foot tall cliff on stage that he could leap off of one bound. But his greatest achievement, anything, incidentally, he could play modern comedies, light comedies, tragedies, but Shakespeare was his specialty. He knew it all. In Indianapolis on 3 days in a row, he played Othello one day, Hamlet the next, and Lear the third. Knew all of the language backward and forward, but his greatest role was Richard III, Shakespeare's mad, deformed king. And the highlight of that was the sword fight scene at the end when Richard is fighting the Duke of Richmond. And Booth insisted that had their costumes getting ripped. But in this sword fight scene, when it began, remember this is pre-television, pre-film, pre-internet. The entire audience in these theaters is standing up because they've never seen anything more dramatic. Booth will sometimes drive the actor playing Richmond into the footlights, sometimes off the stage. And then one night, I think it was in Chicago, the actor playing Richmond miscounted the number of right hand blows with left hand blows, came down full force across Booth's forehead, cut through his right eyebrow all the way. Blood is spurting all over the place. The actor playing Richmond is sitting there turning blue, aghast. Booth is like, come on, man, come back at me, save the fight. So, once I read this, I realized if we've got Booth's personality so dead wrong, what else is wrong? And then I started digging into this, and what became clear rather quickly is that Booth had contacts with the Confederate Secret Service. And again, this was not original research, particularly by me. There was a wonderful amateur Civil War historian named James O. Hall, deceased. He spent his career in working for the Bureau of Labor Statistics, Washington, D.C., unearthed lots of documents that people had not seen. And then he connected with two former CIA intelligence agents. They published a book called Come Retribution in the 1980s. It is by far the worst written book I've ever read in my life. This was the great sacrifice for my art to read that. But if you pull through it, you see all of these connections with Booth, with the Confederate Secret Service. A couple I'd like to point out. One happens late summer 1864. Booth travels to Boston, but he's not giving any performances. He's not seen any performances. He stays at the Parker House Hotel in Boston. And it's later determined by looking at the guest register that while he's there, there's also three gentlemen who have come from Montreal, again, where the Confederate Secret Service is headquartered, all under aliases. And there is a belief that perhaps this was an early connection of a meeting between them. But more important than that, shortly a few weeks after that, Booth goes to Baltimore. He meets a couple of his high school friends, and now he talks to them about trying to enlist them in a plot to kidnap or perhaps kill President Lincoln. Booth says, I now know all of the route through which President Lincoln goes from the White House to the soldiers' home. I know he goes up 14th Street, turns right on Columbia Road, all of this stuff. He now knows all this. He says, I know how we can sneak the president through the Confederate secret line south of downstream from Washington across the Potomac River. He says, I've got plenty of money. I've got plenty of guns and be able to deal with this. Well, there's no smoking gun here, but there's an awful lot of smoke. And the idea that John Wilkes Booth, who is an actor, suddenly had all this information on its own, I would suggest to you, is false thinking. Right? And that instead he is getting encouraged to do this by someone else. And there's another strong piece of evidence. The actress's name was Clara Morse. She's very interesting. She actually lived to the 1920s, but she was a dear friend of Booth. She acted with Booth together on stage, and she wrote a memoir, My Life on Stage, around 1908. And she has a chapter on Booth that's just fabulous with detail. She clearly knew him. And at the end of it, she says, Booth couldn't organize anything. He was this romantic figure. She said, there was no doubt in my mind he was a pawn in someone else's game. They knew that Booth was very loyal to the South, very pro-slavery, pro-Confederacy. And she said there was just no question in her mind that he was working at the behest of someone else. Well, there's a lot more to this book, but let me just close. I've talked longer than I wanted to, just with a couple of thoughts about why I wrote the book and how I wrote it as I did. The vast majority of Civil War books are military history. Okay, they're about generals and battles and lines of supply and ordnance and things like that. 85% of Civil War books are that, and there's nothing wrong with that. I love military history. There's also a subset of books about Lincoln and the politicians of the era. Then there's a very thin sliver of books about African Americans during the Civil War, and an even thinner sliver of books about women during the Civil War. There's a problem with that because if you go back to the notion that this is the first modern war, women are very important to the war. African Americans are central to the war. Lincoln said that if it hadn't been for the U.S. colored troops, we would have lost the war. So one thing I wanted to do in this book is to try to make it a more holistic history and bring in these other parts of the war that are also very important, to the eventual end of the war. So in the book, you're going to see the big names. You're going to see Lincoln and Grant and Sherman and Lee and Davis and all that, but you're also going to read about people you may not know about. For example, Amanda Aiken was a well-off Northern woman from New York. The war broke out, and she decided that she had to do something to help. So she moves to Washington, D.C. She ends up working as a nurse in the Armory Square Hospital which were 12 different wards, a massive hospital that was right on the National Mall, right across from the Smithsonian Castle. She worked 16 hours a day. She helped with surgery. She helped bandage wounds. She trains dressing on the men. She bathed soldiers. She rented her own piano to play them music. She would write letters back home to them. And when they died, she would write letters to their family telling them that they had died. There were lots like that. Louisa May Alcott, Little Women, she did the same thing. She said, I wish I was a man, I could fight, but I can't. She went to Washington, D.C., worked as a nurse in a small hospital in Georgetown. And she became the one that the Union doctors would have break the news to a soldier that they were not going to make it. She later said, I had to find a way to cork up my feelings and do my job and not worry about the emotions involved. Incredible actions like that. And just the other heroes. I think a lot about Charles Gilbert Gould, who was a 16-year-old Vermont farm boy. The war breaks out. He lies about his age, joins the Union Army. By the time the Petersburg campaign happens, he's now a captain at age 19, and he's the first Union soldier to break the line at Petersburg, for which he's immediately gets two bayonet wounds, one through a cheek. He's shot as well too, and goes. And the point with all this is that we live in a very cynical age right now in this country. And that's the reality. And we live in an age where patriotism has been muted for a long time. I see it a lot. I teach in college. I have 23-year-old twin sons. I know their generation. The reality is that the things that we enjoy as Americans have been fought for with blood. And one thing I wanted to do is to remind us of our glorious history and of those members in our past who have given us all of these privileges and rights and freedoms that we enjoy. And as important as Lincoln is, as important as Grant is, the reality is that the United States, the Union was saved because of a remarkable and unprecedented in our history coalition of men and women, blacks and whites, free and unfree, native born and immigrant, who were able to join together. They defeated the Confederacy, they destroyed slavery, they preserved the Union, and they gave our country a second chance to do a better job of living up to our founding ideals. And all of us today stand on their shoulders. They saved their country during their time. Let's hope that we can as well. Thank you very much. Okay. So I'm a little rusty. I talked longer than I planned, but you all were an attentive audience.